Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. How about you? Good stuff, good stuff. Well, without further ado, we're going to hear from our first panelist, Ruby Sales.
Thank you very much. Let me just begin by saying a hearty thank you to Catherine Hart, for members of the EDS community who conceptualized and who made this conversation possible. I'm so happy to be a part of this discourse as we look at Jonathan's witness 50 years later. I also want to just recognize my guest, Cheryl Blankenship, who's been my partner on this journey for more than 21 years, and my dear friend, Reverend Nancy Talbot, who's been my friend for almost 35 years. We are on the road for about 10 days. When we leave EDS, I'm pleased to say I will be headed to Westchester University, where I will be receiving an honorary doctorate degree for my work in public service. And as always, they're on the journey with me. So thank you very much, Nancy and Cheryl. It has indeed been 50 years since Tom Coleman assassinated Jonathan Daniels in Lowndes County, Alabama. And I think that 50 years, is, if I'm correct, stands for an age of maturity after being in the wilderness for 40 years. If we really apply that concept to struggle, the question on the table today, as we think about Jonathan's witness, is where do we go from here? And in order to fully engage that question, we must approach it with hindsight, insight, and foresight. Without any of those sights, we are bound to have, at best, a fragmented analysis and a lack of memory if we don't have hindsight. I just want to begin by saying that Jonathan and I were the two most unlikely people to meet in the world that we lived in the segregated South. He had come from New England. He was a white patriarch, heading to be a white patriarch, had a comfortable seat around the king's table, although he was always different, and took a radical departure in the road. I was a young African-American girl who had grown up in the heat, the torrid heat of Southern apartheid, had gone to Tuskegee and decided that I didn't want to get married, be a teacher, and have 2.5 children. And I took a radical departure in the road. We were both alike in many ways, because if there were a name that could be given to both of us, I would say that we were beatniks or dissidents. And that was the thing that really bound us together. And so Jonathan left his home, where he became a stranger in a land of people who did not know the sound of his name, and he did not know the sound of their names. I thought about that when I came to EDS, because I came to a place where I was a stranger in a land where people did not know the sound of my name, and I did not know the sound of their name. And trust me, Angela can tell you, I was really lost in all of this theological language, because I had grown up in the Southern Baptist tradition where we didn't have theological language in the same way, that our theological language was rooted in black spirituals, was rooted in the black prayers. And so this was a whole different kind of God talk, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost kind of God talk. And so for a year, I was lost in the wilderness, as I'm sure Jonathan was lost in the wilderness. And it was only after I graduated, to be perfectly honest, that things began to click in my head. And I sort of finally got it. But at any rate, I think we share it. And so When Jonathan came to Lowndes County, Alabama, he entered a world where people like me, on the one hand, in the white society, was considered a second-class citizen and a second-class human being. In the black community, I was considered a first-class citizen and a first-class human being. That African American communities had, through years of resistance, developed the cultural resources that humanized us in the arid soil of segregation. They made the soil of segregation very hopeful. They developed, as resisting people do, a counterculture. And that counterculture was rooted in a theology and a pedagogy of somebody-ness. That white society might say that you are second class, but within this pedagogy and theology, we were somebody. We were first-class people in the eyes of a first-class God, and we were first-class citizens and first-class people, not in a democracy that existed, but one that we could help bring into being. So as I think about having a conversation today, many thoughts come to my head, but the first thing that I want to say in order to frame this conversation is, what does it mean to be Christians? What does it mean to be a part of a seminarian education in an era of disposability and human waste? What does it mean to be a Christian? Or what does it even mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be in a capitalist technocracy where only a few lives are essential? We live in a capitalist technocracy where only a few lives are essential. We see that manifested every day. Now, we talked a lot about poverty, but another critical thing that we must talk about today, a variable, is racism. That when you look at Michael Brown, when you look at Billy Joe Johnson, when you look at Ariana Jones, when you look at Melissa Williams, when you look at the executions by police since 2007, Cheryl and I have been traveling up and down the country since 2007, documenting state-sanctioned murders in this country. And we call them state-sanctioned murders because they enjoy the cover of the law. That usually they happen from police who enjoy the cover of the law. And people might argue that this is really something new, but really it has a long history in the bloody roots of American society. That's why Thurgood Marshall emerged as such a prominent lawyer, because he was going around the country dealing with state-sanctioned murders. That's why black women and their white female allies worked very hard to get an anti-lynching bill that never came to be in Congress. And so that we are still on this journey of dealing with state-sanctioned murders in a militarized era. And by militarized, what I mean is that not only the weapons that are used, which are cast-off weapons from wars that we've started in the Middle East, but also tactics that are being used where the person whom you are accosting is an enemy, and that you use those kind of tactics to destroy that person, not to constrain them, but to bring them down. And one of the things that I discovered when I was looking at what it means to live in a militarized police state was that the Koch brothers have a factory in Columbus, Georgia, where they manufacture weapons, and where they're the ones who they say first in the Middle East and secondly to police forces. That's their slogan. So their weapons not only go to the Middle East, but they recycle these weapons to police departments. The other thing that I want to talk about, Jonathan Daniels came south, and I know people don't like to hear this, in a closed and fascist society. And what I mean by that is only one voice was allowed to be heard. and that was a white segregationist voice. And Jonathan was murdered because he offered an alternative voice to that fascist voice. And it was also a society where terrorism was the order of the day and violence. There's murder on the road in Alabama, yeah, there's murder on the road in Alabama, yeah. If you're black or if you're white, you're targeted in the night in Alabama, yay. This is the world that Stokely and I entered. I had never seen violence. I had not come from a violent home. My parents had protected me from the ugliness of segregation. I had no horrible experiences of being called nigger because my family, the community, had really developed a counterculture where they shielded us from those dehumanizing experiences and taught us that we would be authentic leaders in the world. So when I went out in the world with that attitude, not of inferiority, but bustling with this sense of authentic leadership, sometimes that got me in trouble with white people. But they should have met my mom and they would have understood. And so Jonathan, in many ways, was seasoned to be a leader. And he was a leader. And so I think as we move forward, I've heard a lot of conversation. And what I hear, 1 minute left. Wow, how do I get there? Let me just throw out some names real quick. Southern Strategy, ALEC, the return of states' rights, the evisceration of the power of the federal government, 40 years of mobilizing resentment among white people who believe that the Southern Freedom Movement eroded their rights and that they've suffered by paying taxes for lazy black people who don't want to work, coded language developed by Lee Atwater. We've come this far by a carefully orchestrated campaign of former Dixiecrats who took over the Republican Party and who's brought this country to where it is today. I think I'm done, right? 1 minute.
Well, that'll be tough to follow. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to be sitting next to a hero of mine, Ruby. I've never met her before today, but it certainly followed many of the great things that she's been doing. And it's great to be back here, too, at EDS, where in 2007, I got my Doctor of Ministry. And so I look out at some really great professors, and what this EDS helped me to do was to focus in on an issue that was really important to me and that ultimately was transforming for my parish. Matter of fact, my DMin thesis was called The Transformation-Driven Parish, as we focused in on immigration. You know, my sister bishop in Connecticut, Laura Ahrens, she's rewritten the baptismal covenant. Now, I didn't think bishops had the power to do that, but apparently we do. And she's taken those 5 great questions that we have in the baptismal covenant. You know, those questions about, will you respect the dignity of every human being? Will you strive for justice and peace among all people? And she's rephrased it to say, where will you respect the dignity of every human being? Where will you serve justice and peace? Where will you do it? Because we have an incarnational faith. You know, these things aren't abstractions, they're real. So one of those realities for me in Grace Church Millbrook, where I was for 12 years, was I recognized in this upscale neighborhood, there was a lot of folks who were riding around on lawn trucks who were Latino. And we had all these horse farms being worked at with Latino people. And I would say to my congregation, who are they? Where do they go to church? What are their lives like? And for about 4 years, I got completely blank looks. Until a couple of people who had served together in the U.S. Diplomatic Corps to Latin America years earlier just happened to move in to the parish at the same time. And they heard me, and they got completely behind this, which is my first of several lessons in terms of working for justice is you need allies. You cannot do this work alone. And so what we did was we really engaged the Latino community, and we had all kinds of forums throughout the summer of 2005. We had a community organizer who brought people together, and we just talked to them about what their lives were like. And based off their expression of their different needs, we recognized that a lot of the folks were undocumented immigrants from Mexico and from Guatemala. They had a real desire to learn English, so we had English as a second language classes. We had fiestas because we were in a rural area, so they didn't have a place to gather like people often do in an urban setting. We had tax workshops because we recognized that there's no path to citizenship, but eventually there would be, and if you paid your taxes, you'd be further up on that list. But as we did those things, which are all service-oriented things, we moved from there into advocacy. And we recognized that undocumented immigrants couldn't get driver's licenses. And so we really entered the political realm of petitioning for that. And we took out full-page ads in the local papers talking about that and showing how even the police forces wanted undocumented people to have driver's licenses. Eliot Spitzer in New York at that time started to favor that. I was called upon in the Dutchess County Legislature to testify about that. I was really, really eloquent, and then they voted, and they voted it down 27-1. And then Eliot Spitzer had his own problems, and the whole movement towards getting undocumented immigrants licenses collapsed. But that also leads me to another insight in terms of a lesson I've learned in terms of working in justice. It's really a call sometimes to embrace failure, to enter into disappointment. You know, a big part of what I did was to accompany people who were undocumented, who had been picked up by the police and were to be deported, and to go with them on their trial, to go with them down to Texas before they'd be held and then ultimately moved out. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to do. To show how hard that would be for me, you know Romans 8, the wonderful passage from Romans 8. Everyone reads it at their funeral, right? Romans 8 begins with, if God is for us, who could be against us? And then it's got that great ending about nothing can separate us from the love of God, and lists all those things that can't separate us from the love of God. But in the middle, there's that passage about we're like lambs being led to the slaughter. It's a quote that Paul uses from Isaiah. I hated that quote. I don't want to be a lamb led to the slaughter. Matter of fact, what I would do in our Bible at the church was I knew people were going to read that passage for a funeral, and so I bracketed out lambs being led to the slaughter. And I would tell the person who was going to read, don't read that part. Just read the rest of it. Let's stay upbeat. Let's stay positive here. Although the one day I told that to a person who was going to read at her father's funeral and said, don't read the part in brackets. Well, she came up and she read just the part in brackets. She read, we are like lambs being led to the slaughter. And then she sat down. But there's a truth to that, to be able to enter into people's lives even though we knew it was going to fail. Hopefully not forever. Hopefully someday there'll be immigration reform. But to enter into their frustration and to enter into their disappointment, like lambs being led to the slaughter, to willingly do that. Another lesson that I've learned in terms of justice work is really from St. Augustine. They asked St. Augustine one time, how do you become holy? And St. Augustine, this profound scholar, had this answer. Find holy people and hang out with them. That's how you do it. Well, in justice work, what we need to do is find people committed to justice and hang out with them. That's been true in my life. When I was a seminarian, there's this friend, Billy Schmidt. I was all involved in theology. I was going to be a systematic theologian. And he said, we've got this thing going on called the nuclear arms race right now. And he really engaged me in that issue, and he introduced me to Dan Berrigan, and we hung out, and that made a huge difference in my life. And now in Western Massachusetts, I hang out with people like Margaret Bullock Jonas and your own Bud Cedarholm, and they've convinced me that climate change is upon us, that climate change is here, and we need to do radical things like divest from fossil fuel companies. And that's not because something that I know about, but it's something because I hang out with people who are engaged in that. Another dimension I found along the way in terms of justice work is that causes will find us. Causes will find us. When I came to Western Massachusetts 3 years ago, I knew nothing about casinos. I'd never stepped in a casino. I was completely casino neutral. But casinos found me. And I was surrounded by people who really engaged that issue, and then I engaged it with them. It was 2 weeks after I was made a bishop that the tragedy, the massacre happened at Sandy Hook, just not far from Western Massachusetts. And all of a sudden, gun violence, which was not an issue in my life, became a huge issue. And it became something I got involved in a really deep way. And when they were having the Massachusetts legislature were considering those different gun laws a couple of summers ago, I testified in Springfield in a crowd that was completely packed with people from Smith & Wesson who had and talked about those different laws with gun violence and talked about them on television, interviewed about them. But it's an issue that found me. So another lesson that I've learned in terms of justice work is to recognize that Jesus, as much as Jesus talked about love, Jesus, even more important than that, used words like stay awake, look, see, be aware, wake up, look at what's around us, look at what's around us. And that will sensitize us to a whole nother world, which is the discrepancy between the kingdom of God, which is Jesus' mission of mercy and compassion, of hope, and what really is. And when we see that, we will be enlivened by a Holy Spirit to work for the kingdom of God. Thank you.
I want to thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm not sure why I'm part of this. I didn't graduate from EDS. I'm not an Episcopalian, though I'm frequently mistaken for one. I bring you greetings in the name of our moderator, the Reverend Elder Nancy Wilson, who did graduate from EDS. So there. And I didn't know Jonathan Daniels, obviously, but I want to invoke his spirit here today and that of all the saints who I think pray for us every day on behalf of a world at peace with its own diversity. I'm here on behalf of the Global Justice Institute, which represents the social justice arm of Metropolitan Community Churches. We are currently partnering with human rights activists and LGBTI people and our allies in places like China, Malaysia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, India, Indonesia. We've completed a project in Pakistan, Eastern Europe, Russia, Latin and Central America, Jamaica, East Africa, South Africa, the United States, and Canada. Our mission statement reads in part to be an agent of change by building bridges that liberate and unite voices of sacred defiance in acts of justice. We adhere, as many of our human rights colleagues around the globe do, to something called the Yogyakarta Principles, which you can find, if you're interested in them, at the UN website in 6 languages, I think. But in general, those principles talk about things like the right of people to dignity, the right of people to feel secure in their own land, the right of people to have health care, the right of people to have jobs, those kinds of things. There are 29 principles listed there. And in general, we follow these guidelines to go only where we are invited. We're not missionaries, though we are faith-based. We're not seeking to impose either our religious beliefs or ideas about social change that we carry with us, but rather we're trying to connect with people on the ground who have their own ideas about social change and learn from them how we might be partners with them. We assume we have a lot to learn. We listen to our hosts. We forge partnerships, as I said. We speak if we're asked to speak, that is, if it's too dangerous for other people to speak. As an American, and people who have traveled know this, you can often say a lot of things that other people in their own countries cannot get away with. So sometimes people ask you to do that, and it's good to use your privilege to do that. We're committed to understanding that our priority is always the furtherance of the human rights effort on the ground. Sometimes, as was the case with our partnership in Jamaica, people say things to us like, what we really need is a safe space to worship in. And so a worshiping community will develop out of the global justice or social justice efforts, but it's not our intention to go in and build a church or something like that. That said, safe space is kind of an overarching theme around the world, I think, people trying to find safe space in various kinds of capacities. We were all asked today to speak under the theme of Walk Towards Justice and to tell our stories addressing 6 points and to do that in 10 minutes. And I'll do my best. During my lifetime, things for the queer community have changed dramatically in several areas of the world. And some say because of those changes, become much worse for queer people in other parts of the world. I'm not sure that I think that analogy holds universally or absolutely true, but this I do believe. Queer rights, and perhaps I should say just as a footnote here, I'm not even sure that I like that term queer rights. I think more what I like is the term queer realities, and that's what I feel like I'm trying to engage or fight for. The right of our realities, our lives, to be recognized and to be safe and to be honored and to be treated with dignity. But having said that, the parlances, queer rights, are often used as a weapon of mass distraction. People far better connected and informed than I am will tell you that a government unwilling to equitably or even minimally share the resources of oil wealth in northern Uganda, and therefore unable to address widespread poverty, underemployment, and healthcare issues like the rise of HIV and AIDS, chose instead to initiate an anti-homosexuality bill, also known as the Kill the Gays bill, and to refocus internal debate and unrest and make people think that their lives depended on killing other people, which perhaps to some degree equates, not in terms of degree, I don't mean it that way, but somehow draws a connection between queer rights and rights for African American people in the United States. You know, it shows us, I think, that what most movements are about is just making a way for people to live and not be killed off in some way, shape, or form. They did so in Uganda with the fiscal and so-called moral support of Western-based religious voices and organizations, which I think points to one of the chief changes in the understanding internal to and the architecture of the queer rights movement over the past 40 to 50 years, particularly in the West. And now I'm like only on point 2 and I have only 4 minutes, but namely that all of our oppressions, or more positively, all of our movements for equality are interconnected, and so our strategies for change need to reflect that. From the standpoint of oppressions, Brazil, for example, offers a lot of rights to queer people. It's legal for us to exist there. We can get married there. We have some health care benefits there. Immigration equality exists there. Yet Brazil also has one of the highest murder rates of queer people in the world. 1 death every 2 days. And every 2 hours, a woman is murdered there, and every 15 seconds, a woman is a victim of domestic assault. It's much higher for transgender women. Brazil has the most organized women's movement in Ibero-America, and yet the 7th highest rate of violence against women in the world. And I think those kind of realities speak to the partnerships that need to exist between our movements. So, for example, in Eastern Europe, our partnership is with something called the Center for Public Initiative, Euro-Regional Center for Public Initiatives, which is primarily a women's rights group, because those are the issues that can bond together to make a difference. From the standpoint of positive social change, I want to talk a little bit about a kid named Molly, who was 11 years old when his parents in Uganda thought that he might be gay and so threw him out. His dream was to become a sugarcane farmer, and when we met him, he had 1 acre of rented land and a plan. If he could have 3 acres of land and build a barn, he could hire 10 other workers, 7 of whom would be queer in his mind and 3 straight. His vision for social change was that if people worked together and demonstrated their need for interdependence in terms of survival, that maybe queer people wouldn't be hacked or chased out of their villages. It's been the same principle that we've used with Dennis, a brickmaker outside of Kampala. It's a strategy originating in the lives of queer people on the ground in places like Uganda. I'm not saying that there aren't those working for legislative change or policy change or international kinds of things, but rather that all of these efforts have to somehow be bonded together, and that we have to look at the bigger picture and have a wider angle lens in which all of these little things somehow work together for positive change. In the United States, we have marriage equality in 37 states, but we also have 37 states where it's legal to fire a person because they're transgender or gay. So somehow marriage equality has not solved all of our problems, and we need to bond queer rights and that movement with the right for workers' rights and the work to be safe and have a job. I think all of this speaks to the need to both strive to see as much of the big picture as possible, even though you may end up addressing only one small portion, and do so with the wider vision in mind, and always take the long view. Or as our founder Troy Perry said to me long ago, we're not doing this for ourselves, but for those who come after us. There will always be immediate needs that must be addressed now, and trying to address them in a way that points us where we ultimately want to go is important for the foundations that we're either trying to eradicate or lay. All over the world, I see people and meet people and am in communication with people whose greatest resources are simply their dreams or their deep conviction that things can be better for all of us. Reverend Michael Kamindu in Mtito Ande, Kenya, is bringing groups of clergy together in the name of global justice to study the Bible together and say things like, while we may not all agree on what the scriptures do and do not say about queer people, we can agree on this. It says, thou shalt not kill. And we can use that as a basis to work together against violence that's inspired from pulpits and change attitudes toward people living with AIDS and gay people and transgender people. In Costa Rica, we work with a woman named Natasha who lives in a shelter, who cooks breakfast in her shelter every morning and takes it to a park where she feeds anybody who wants to eat for 20 cents. And people come out of the church that's right by the park where this breakfast happens, and doctors eat with homeless people. And her theory is that if we talk to each other across the boundaries that normally separate us, we might learn something. And so they eat breakfast together, they play board games, and then she directs the conversation toward HIV and AIDS, and everybody shares what they do or do not know. And she hopes to bring social change to her community in this way. Marriage equality claims a lot of media space, and I'm grateful that my spouse of 29 years and 2 days and I can claim, yes, we did just celebrate, legal protections in some places. But the real reason it's important, I think, is because it says to people that we are real human beings with real lives and real loves and real families and real hungers and real issues that need to be addressed just like everybody else. And I'm supposed to stop right now.
Wow, thank you to our panelists. I want to begin with the same question that Pan began with before to the first panel, and that was, in the years of your experiences and your participation, what has been transformative for you personally, and how has that made a difference in your faith journey?
Well, you know, Thomas Merton once said that if you deal with God, you're necessarily in over your head. And so if we deal with the God that we believe in, the God who sets the people free from slavery in Egypt, the God who has Jesus get up and give his first sermon about setting the oppressed free, if that's our God, we're necessarily in over our head with God and with justice issues. And so the transformation is that it's an endlessly creative life, that we can never, ever settle for the status quo, because that's not the God we believe in.
I think that when I think about transformation, I think of it as a dynamic process. And for me, I see myself as being in process. And the process, some of the helpful things along the way have been the cultural resources that African Americans developed during enslavement, prayer, songs, the whole notion of community upbuilding, not community building, but community upbuilding, and the power to recreate oneself in the fires of misrepresentation. I've also been very much in process by engaging in conversation with younger people who are beginning to find their voice and beginning to carve out their patch on the quilt and the struggle for freedom. I think in some very, I was just thinking, Angela, when, I came to EDS having studied history at Princeton and thought that to exegete a text was to give a history lesson. But the ability to exegete, to really understand the meaning of constructing and doing a sermon has really been very transforming for me. And the other thing, and I think finally, to see myself in context as part of a continuity, a long struggle for freedom that did not begin with me and will not end with me, gives me the hope and resilience and the reason to keep struggling in these critical times of re-entrenchment of white supremacy, classism, heterosexism, and all of the isms that press us down in very small spaces and allow us not only to see our potential, but not only to see the potential in other people. So I think that so transformation for me is not only individual, it's also communal. So as my communities that I'm a part of are in the process of developing new consciousness and new ways of being, I also am transformed by that process because I don't see myself as an individual who's involved in a process outside of community.
Thank you.
I think several things have been transformative for me. One thing is just the kindness that people have shown me in situations where I might not have expected that. And also, I think my belief that the gospel is a radical social manifesto has transformed me, and my attempt to have a daily spiritual life, and the opportunity I've had to use the gifts I do have. I thought from a young age that I was called to be a Roman Catholic priest. Later, I discovered I was right about the call and wrong about the venue. But the opportunities I've had because of that mistake have been pretty phenomenal. So,
Thank you. Ruby, you asked a question that sparked another thought for me. And you said, what does it mean to be a Christian in a disposable society? I want to piggyback on that a little bit and ask the question, in a land that is growing in biblical illiteracy, what is our moral compass as our source of authority for doing social justice? You indicate being a Christian is part of that, so we can read some things into that statement.
Well, I think that for me, memory comes to being. It comes to mind. It's really important to remember when you were a stranger at the gate, and when you were an outsider, and when your ancestors were not welcome, and what that felt like. To be able to remember that is very important, because what the empire really, you can't have biblical literacy without memory, or without a context for how you read what is the context for the reading. And so I think that memory is very important. And I want to just quickly say something about the age of disposability. When we think about Michael Brown and Billy Joe Johnson, who also laid in the street for 9 hours after the police shot him in a state-sanctioned murder, we see these people, they are seen as disposable waste. Let's just grapple with that, disposable waste. African Americans are seen today as unessential to the project of a capitalist technocracy. In cities where there was once industry, and it's been and there is no more industry or manufacturing. If you look at the data, those cities have the highest incidence of state-sanctioned murders, those states and those cities. Also, we're living in a society where 76% of African Americans, we keep talking about the urban north. That's not where it's at for black people anymore. 70 to 76% of African Americans live in the South. The South will be they left the North. We left the North because there were no more jobs. And also, I think disposable waste means infiltrates itself through the medical industrial complex, the prison industrial complex. And so I think that we have to really be honest and ask, why did Michael Brown's body lie in the street for 4 hours as if it were trash? We saw that with Jesus lying on the cross as an example, and for people to, Jesus was also seen by the empire as disposable waste. So I think that we've got to grapple with, we can't go anywhere until we figure out ways of not only, we talk about broken communities. We must ask ourselves and interrogate our assumptions about who's broken. And what does it mean to be broken? So we've got to develop a new language for the 21st century, and then I'll shut up, that deals with disposability and really interrogate our assumptions, not only about other people, that we don't see people through deficit models, that we see them through models that focus on, I went through segregated schools, and because my school was under-resourced, it didn't mean that I had an inferior mind. And so we've got to really begin to rethink how we do our work and what disposability is when billions of people around the world can't eat.
Okay. Thank you.
That was long-winded, wasn't it?
That's okay. Good answer. Good
Sorry.
response. Would either of our other two panelists care to speak to that issue?
Amen.
Barack Obama encouraged churches and people of faith to get involved in the political process, and so I think that we do it from our perspective of who we are as people who believe. But he said another dimension of that was you needed to make arguments that went across all different faith traditions and people of no faith. So it couldn't be an argument that just made sense to Christians. And so I think that we need to find that kind of common ground, and perhaps that common ground comes in compassion, which is hopefully it's integral to religion, but I think it's also integral just to being a human being.
One more question from me, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And that question is, what anchors your soul today?
We're going to take it from a Christian perspective. Anyone ever hear of the St. John Cassian? Anyone hear of John Cassian? Some of you heard, not, but probably a minority. There's a reason why most people haven't heard of John Cassian, even though he's a saint, is that, each saint gets a day, right? So Jonathan Daniels is getting August 14th, right? And we all know St. Patrick gets March 17th, and St. Francis has October 4th. Do you know what day they gave John Cassian in the Holy Women, Holy Men book? February the 29th. That's exactly right.
A non-existent.
So it's not surprising you haven't heard about him. You think about that. You try your whole life to be a saint, and you get a day that's celebrated every 4 years. But the great insight of John Cassian is that he says, and he was a monk in the 400s, is that we're called to keep the inner gaze of our soul on Christ. Keep the inner gaze of our soul on Christ. And I know that people from other traditions will find a different source of being centered, but for me, that's it. To keep the inner gaze of my soul on Christ.
Okay.
What was the question?
What anchors your soul today?
I think what angers my soul more than anything else is when I see people in power manipulating people who are struggling to find their voices and using power and elitism as a way of shutting down people who are struggling to have to be the legitimate voices who define their lives.
Anchors or so.
Did you say anger or anchor?
No, anchor. Anchor.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was like, did I miss something? Thank you. I need a little help here. When anchors.
Same thing.
Your anchor. All right.
I think that one thing, that freedom is a constant struggle, and that I don't expect instant gratification in a soundbite society. And so I'm anchored by the fact that we've been here before, we won once before, and we can do it again. That anchors me.
Okay.
I think working largely in a community where scripture has been stolen from us and we've been told that our lives aren't there, and having to, every week come up with proof that they are there anchors me in the study of scripture, and I think that's a really important thing.
All right. Thank you. Now, from the floor, questions.
I want to thank all the panelists. My sermon for Sunday is now written. We talk about love this Sunday. I'm from Detroit, even though I've lived here since I came to seminary. And what I'm seeing in Detroit is a lot of what you're talking about, where it is celebrated that Detroit is back on the rise. The backstory of that is that poor people and those on the margins are being forced out of houses that they have lived in for years to make way for luxury housing, given 30 days notice to evacuate. So we have a whole class of people who used to work for the auto industry that, because there is no industry, the new industry is high tech, the new industry is money market, the new industry is stocks and bonds. So in Detroit, there's a lot of have and have-nots, and people are being displaced left and right because of that. That's just a statement. I've also noticed that in this area, in the Massachusetts area, I've been here since '99, and I can say in the past couple of years, I have seen, I don't know if it was always there, but I have seen increase in the number of incidents and statements that have been along racial and ethnic lines increase in the last couple of years. And it's very disturbing to me. And I've heard it from, I've heard it said the same thing, the same reflection from some of my allies.
What's your question?
The question is, how do we center ourselves in the gospel to give ourselves strength to carry on?
I'm quiet because I don't always want to be the one who answers the question.
You have permission.
I don't think that we can do that without being in community. I think it's in community, in our relationship with each other, and the work that we do together to build up the kingdom and also to build up a beloved community, that the gospel becomes real and actualized. I don't think it's a personal journey inward without without being outward and expressing the good news, not only to yourself, but also hearing what other people think about what is their good news. And I think that means being in conversation with people and talking with people about issues.
Let me ask that question a different way, and that question would be, is social justice too vague to be meaningful in the year 2015? The term social justice, is it too vague to be meaningful in the year 2015?
It seems like it's become a red flag word with a lot of people, right? And so it doesn't become a conversation starter, it becomes a conversation ender. So as much as we appreciate that term and try and live into it, you might be right, it might be a different term. But also might be, to go back to Bishop Laura Aarons, that social justice is not an abstraction. So where are we living in that? Where is that happening? And it's all in those kind of contexts, and hopefully that context expands.
I think it's just up to us to make it not vague, and up to us to put a different face on Christianity, and to not let the voice that carries the weight of the Christian faith always be something that seems to be speaking against human needs being met, or equality, or justice, or those kind of things.
Yes and no. I think that it's very important to name the nature of oppression. I think, for example, I was in Ferguson. We went to Ferguson, Spirit House did, and we did a teach-in, and we had a social justice revival. And one of the things that became very clear to me, what I learned at Ferguson, is that many of the young activists who are doing the hardest work are homeless. And then I began to realize, as I talk with young folk, that young black people are homeless, even with college degrees. The homeless population is growing. So if we don't name it, sometimes we obscure the nature of the oppression. So I think yes and no. I think that we are because we've talked globally about social justice, that we can't tell each other the last 5 Supreme Court decisions that have eradicated justice in this country. We can't talk about the Southern strategy and the ways in which this strategy has usurped federal power and created states' rights again, and what that has meant for Medicare and all of the other kinds of programs that were essential to people. And finally, I want to say that one of the issues that we're dealing with under this justice question is a quality of life question, where in New York in 1990s, a law was passed that talked about the quality of life, and that law was used to remove that homeless people threatened the quality of life in New York. And that was circulated, boilerplate legislation circulated around the nation, and then it moved from homeless people to black people and Puerto Rican people. So I think that we need to, if we're going to talk about justice, we at least need to name the issues.
Well, I was just going to add, and what they're going to do in New York City right now is decriminalize quality of life violations by making them civil violations, but people will still have to pay fines. So I'm not sure, quality of life violation is like a queer kid hanging out on the pier, and the village, which was traditionally a place where LGBT people found safety, has been gentrified. And so young, usually white, upwardly mobile families don't want their kids seeing another kid voguing on the piers. So he commits a quality of life violation and can be arrested. So the talk is, instead of eliminating that, well, we'll just make it a civil matter. But there will still be a fine attached, and the real question is, why can't a kid vogue on the pier? You know, I mean, what is the big, you know what voguing is, right?
No, tell us.
Well, I can't do it. You know, it's like a kid sort of strutting around like they're on a runway or something, you know, flipping their hair and being Beyonce or somebody, you know, you know. And that's a quality of life violation because a quote, child should not have to see that. Well, or a homeless person sleeping on a bench can be a quality of life violation. Or a homeless person urinating can be a quality of life violation. Or a homeless person approaching someone at a sidewalk cafe for food can be a quality of life violation. So that it's code for what some people don't want to have to look at.
Right.
Thank
Did
you.
y'all know about quality of life violations?
No.
Sagging pants, all of those things, quality of life.
I didn't. Is there another question from the
Thank
floor?
you very much.
One in the back. Yes.
Oh, speak to know that you knew about.
Thank you. My comment is as one from outside the country, a non-U.S. citizen, observing for the past 17, 18, 19 years, connecting to what Ruby just made a comment about the Supreme Court judgments. For me, underlying the political, economic, juridical aspects of this country seems to be based on a lie, an illusion of individual freedom, individuality. Until somehow the faith communities expose that lie and speak a counter language, which you, all of you, identify as community, communal memory, communal resources. But unfortunately, our theologies, our hymnodies have privatized God and celebrate individualism. Our pastoral ministry is narrowly family-centered, quote, family-centered. And I honestly feel, I think coming back to Abbott's question earlier, until this school and all of Christian community somehow sees the countercultural proclamation calling the lie out, nothing can happen. The capitalistic technocracy, the era of disposability will continue safe and sound. I don't know what we would do in order to attempt at that throning this lie, which is at the back. Unfortunately, it has spread, the lie has spread all over the country, all over the world, including my country,
What country is that?
India.
Could it be that our churches have lost their voice? Our churches have lost their voice? Because we're in a community where mainstream churches are not like they used to be. I'm trying to avoid using the term dying. I don't think the church will ever be dead. But when you look around our community in particular, our churches are not filled to capacity like they used to be. So somehow or other, the gospel or the message or our voices have been co-opted, and we've been silenced, and yet those other voices are gaining their voice, and the church is not responding. So that's going to go back to the EDS question, as well as the other seminaries throughout our community, is how do we begin to take back the church and begin to make differences and help our people to learn how to speak up, stand up, and march is what I've been hearing this afternoon, taking back the communities that really are struggling. I don't know if it's a fear or what, but maybe our panelists will have some final thoughts about.
It's a great point, and it's and I would say it's not even a case of the church going in decline, because that if the church doesn't have a voice, society goes into a decline. So it's so I think that the churches do need to speak out on these things, and I think a great example of that would be would be climate change. I think that one of the reasons that the civil rights movement went as far as it did, needs to go a lot further, but the reason it went as far as it did was because of church involvement. And churches are not involved, I don't think, in a great way in creation care in terms of climate change. And the climate change movement has not taken root in the country. I think it's because churches have been silent on that, as it's been silent on other issues. So it's not the decline of the church, it's the decline of society because churches don't speak out.
Well, that question predicates itself on certain assumptions. That the church, I know that the mainline churches that I grew up with in the South certainly did not have a Southern Freedom voice, movement voice. That the churches undergirded segregation, and there was a great marriage between the church and the segregated state. We see the marriage today between the church and a right-wing state and a conservative state. And so we must really, and so the people who were involved in the Southern movement was the radical edge of the church. Let's be very clear about that. They were not the heart of the church. And Episcopalians around the South, I know that Jonathan tried to take his friends to St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Selma, Alabama, and they couldn't get in the front door. So I'm saying that we must tell ourselves the truth about the situation. So we must have a radical movement where the church begins to ask itself, as Gordon Cosby would say, what does it mean to be church in the 21st century in a culture of violence and disposability? The movement succeeded in the Southern Freedom Movement. It was more than a civil rights movement. It was a Southern Freedom Movement that offered the opportunity for both white and black people to reclaim our humanities and to have a clear vision to the kingdom of God. So it was a movement that benefited both black people and white people. So when we talk about the church and the role that it plays, it's not just what you injustice does not just press down black people or Latino people. It presses down white people in very small spaces where the world becomes a very scary place to be, and you're looking over your shoulders thinking that somebody wants something that you have. So I think the church has to really continue. The radical edge of the church has to continue to locate its voice through doing global work, working on queer issues, working on racial justice issues, continuing to not get lost in the muddle, but to talk about the good news and to, we need more people on the road like Jesus.
And perhaps as a closing thought, the question that Micah 6 and 8 asks, what does the Lord require of us? It is not just an individual question, but it certainly is a communal question. Could we give our panel a round of applause?